Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching from. Welcome to this edition of the Scott Ritter Show. Today is Monday, July 10th, 2023. We are one day out from the NATO summit that is convening in Vilnius, Lithuania, to discuss primarily the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of other issues related to this. The United States decision to provide cluster munitions, the Turkish decision to release Azov prisoners, and Vladimir Putin's recent meeting with Prigozhin and Wagner commanders. A lot of questions, a lot of people looking for answers, and I don't think there's anybody better than our guest today to help us find these answers. Dmitry Badovich, a Russian political commentator, joins us, and thank you very much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I always dreamed of talking to you, Scott, and I hope our conversation will be interesting. A good continuation for the battle that I had yesterday on Al Jazeera English with someone named William Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, who seemed to know everything, who knew how much cluster weapons Russia had, how often they failed, that they failed much more often than the American cluster weapons. So I basically had a hard talk with him. I encourage people to watch because in the end he had nothing to say and I had a lot to say. So the themes, the subject that you mentioned are just great. So whichever you choose, let's start from the one that interests you most and the viewers also.
Well, why don't we start with the one that you've touched upon, which is the issue of cluster munitions. Just to provide a background, I'm not a former U.S. ambassador. I don't claim to know everything, and it's like everything. It's I believe in informed debate, discussion, and dialogue in the pursuit of fact-based truth. So, the United States has made a decision to supply Ukraine with a specific kind of cluster munition. A cluster munition is basically a weapon that delivers smaller submunitions. We'll call them cluster bombs. The idea is to deliver destructive power over a wider area than you would with just a conventional unitary high explosive shell. These cluster munitions can be used to attack personnel, and they can also be used to disable or destroy vehicles. That's why they're called dual purpose improved conventional munitions. In particular, the United States is deploying what's called the M864 round. It's a 155 millimeter artillery shell that production began in 1987. That's an important date, by the way, to remember. And production ended in 1996. The United States has put all of these shells into what we call the war reserve. We don't train with these shells. We put them in the war reserve. And since 2016, we haven't used them in combat. And the reason is that the United States, even though we're not a signature to an international agreement, I think it's called the Cluster Munitions Convention, that would ban these weapons. We have not signed this because we view cluster munitions as being a very important weapon to have if we're ever confronted with massed attacks like we could face on the Korean Peninsula against the North Korean army, or even in Europe if we ever had to fight Russia. So we've held on to these weapons, and we've been very critical of Russia. By the way, we've criticized Russia and Ukraine, less Ukraine, mainly Russia, for using cluster munitions in the ongoing conflict. But I think it's also important to point out that neither Ukraine nor Russia are signatories to this agreement. So there's no violation of the law taking place. But we've criticized Russia nonetheless, and now we've made this decision to send these weapons to Ukraine. And I've been searching for a reason why. I mean, is this a military necessity? Does Ukraine suddenly need American cluster munitions, or is there something else at stake? And I think Joe Biden answered that question the other day. it's because we've run out of ammunition to give Ukraine, that ultimately we don't have enough conventional high explosive rounds to give to Ukraine to meet their ammunition expenditure rates in support of their ongoing counteroffensive. So we've given them these cluster munitions. And I think we have to explore the moral reasons for this. Suddenly we've decided that a shell hunger is worthy of giving weapons that we ourselves say shouldn't be used in combat. We've condemned Russia to use. We're saying that. And two, do these weapons really change the outcome on the battlefield? The United States brags about very low dud rates, but I think the New York Times has written an article that suggests that the dud rate for American shells could be as high as 20%, and that implies that the shell's working well. But remember, I asked you to remember that date of 1987, 1996. These shells have a 20-year shelf life, 20 years. And
maybe I will say a few words here, because you just described perfectly the situation, but it all came as a surprise. To me, at least. I don't know about you, but I was surprised to read this article in the Washington Post on Friday. Suddenly, an article just modestly headlined, "Biden approves cluster munition supply to Ukraine," right? And then what do we read in that article? That basically hundreds of thousands of people, could already have lost their lives because of cluster munitions, that were left in Iraq, that were left in Yugoslavia. Basically, the United States Congress passed a resolution a few years ago which prohibited the United States government to send these weapons to any foreign countries, because these weapons were considered too dangerous and too deadly, And also, the problem is with cluster munitions is that even when the war ends, all of these unexploded shells that you mentioned, they can be dangerous for the local population for many years to come. We don't know how many. During this conversation on Al Jazeera English, I suddenly heard from a lady from Human Rights Watch that actually Biden had the right to send cluster munitions to Ukraine. Why? Because he could put a waiver on this congressional decision not to send weapons. Then my question is, what do we need the Congress for? If the president can send deadly weapons to any country, even a country at war, then what's the use of Congress? The president can just put a waiver and send any weapons anywhere he wants. Basically, you're right. Biden justified this decision by the fact that Ukraine was running out of ammunition. And also he talked about something like equalizing the chances, or at least this is mentioned in that article in the Washington Post, that this is one of the arguments of the supporters of that decision, that this would equalize the chances. Well, I mean, chemical weapons would equalize the chances even better, This is the whole problem, with cruel, deadly weapons. They immediately give to one of the sides huge superiority, okay? And when chemical weapons were invented during the World War I remember reading English generals at the time who said, why should we prohibit these weapons? The effect of a poisonous gas is roughly the same as the effect of an exploding shell, or a bullet, that it just kills you. Yes, you suffer, but that's war. However, humanity was wise enough to decide that you don't equalize the chances by providing weapons that would be harmful for the civilian population, that would be harmful for nature, that would just allow one person to kill indiscriminately several thousand persons. This is not the way to lead the war, even in modern times, even in this very cruel so far 21st century. So basically, the story with the use of cluster weapons is interesting, because that article in the Washington Post mentioned that Ukrainian troops used cluster weapons against Donbass during the first very, very cruel months of the war in 2014. Let me remind our viewers that the war in Ukraine did not start in 2022, as the Western media claims. It started back in 2014, maybe even in 2013, you know, when the Maidan coup started and 38 policemen were killed and hundreds of them maimed, a lot of them burned by Molotov cocktails. You know, these so-called peaceful protesters in Kiev, they used basically modern weapons, you know, and the United States called them all peaceful protesters, and the EU did the same, unfortunately. So the war started in somewhere between 2013 and 2014, and the Ukrainian army used cluster weapons. This was documented by the Human Rights Watch, an organization that can hardly be suspected of being sympathetic towards Russians and towards the so-called Ukrainian separatists, as it keeps calling, you know, the people of Donbass. Then also the Washington Post said something about Russia using these cluster bombs when it was not mentioned, simply for a very simple reason. I don't remember any news reports, and I don't remember, of course, any Human Rights Watch you know, reports that would mention the use by Russia of cluster weapons. Or at least none of these reports was documented. It was just a hearsay, you know, someone saying, oh, I saw how Russians did it. But, you know, the problem with the cluster weapons is that it's very easy to find them on the ground and to prove that they were used. So the Ukrainian army definitely used them in 2014 and probably 2015. Russia, there is absolutely no proof. And now the United States wants to supply these weapons, to supply these munitions to Ukraine so that it would use them on a massive scale. This is a terrible development. I mean, after the depleted uranium shells, we have cluster weapons. And this is what I said on Al Jazeera English yesterday. I asked the people, okay, look, these people want to supply cluster weapons. They already supplied shells with depleted uranium. And these people say they're for peace. You know, these people say that they are for democracy. You can only save democracy with cluster weapons and the depleted uranium shells? Doesn't sound convincing to me. And the same story, you know, just look at the news, look at the Western press, the news from Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is now storming the oldest monastery in the country, right? The Kiev Lavros, we call it the Kiev monastery. They are removing Russian language from school curriculums. They are removing it from all spheres of life. You know, the language that the majority of the population in Ukraine speaks. They have canceled several holidays, some of them from Soviet times, some of them even from pre-Soviet times. They are banning any films made in the Soviet Union, any films made in Russia, especially after 2014. They are banning books. You know, there are hundreds, thousands of books that they banned. So my question is, if the government is not quite happy with the language of the country, with its religion, with its holidays, with its books, with its films, maybe this government is the occupier. Maybe it's Zelensky who is the occupying power there, and not Russia, you know, because Russia is not canceling anything. It's not prohibiting anything. They prohibit, you know, they try to change the country beyond recognition. And the same story with cluster munitions. If Russia is so bad, if Russia is the aggressor, why is it that the other side wants to use deadliest, most dangerous, inhumane weapons? Cluster munitions or shells with depleted uranium. Why is that? You know, I think this is a very interesting question that I managed to ask in the end of Al Jazeera English program. And I invite you to continue. I mean, what's your impression? I just had these thoughts yesterday, and it seemed to me, they seem to be very convincing to me.
Well, you know, I'm somebody who spent a lot of time in the field artillery with the United States Marine Corps, and we used DPICM extensively. It's, I mean, I don't mean to be too callous, but the military is in the business of killing people. That's our job. And the more efficiently we can kill people, the better we are at our job. And DPICM rounds under certain conditions give us the opportunity to kill a lot of the enemy very efficiently. So I understand why you would want to use DPICM, but it's not a game-changing weapon. It's a weapon. It was designed to be an assault-breaking weapon, meaning that if I'm being attacked by a mass of armor or dismounted infantry that are moving rapidly towards my location, I would want to hit them with cluster munitions in an effort to generate as many casualties as possible. Last time I looked at the Ukrainian battlefield, it seemed to be a positional warfare with heavy emphasis on trenches, dug-in positions in uneven terrain with a lot of overhead vegetation, soil that has been dampened by rain. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is not the ideal environment for using cluster munitions, DPICM artillery rounds. In fact, it's the least desirable way to use it. So you can't say that this is being done out of military necessity, and we know that it's not. And this is what I get. See, as a military guy, if you're telling me that you need to kill the enemy more efficiently, I support that 100%. I'm sorry, it's just war. That's why I'm not a fan of war. That's why I try to prevent war with every ounce of my body, because once you engage in conflict, it's about men killing men, humans killing humans, and there's nothing pleasant about this. But if you're going to make the claim that you need this to achieve a certain level of military efficiency, okay, but that's not why this is being done. And this is where the callousness of this decision comes into play. It's being done because we ran out of normal ammunition. We don't have anything left to give the Ukrainians. And rather than acknowledge that this war cannot be won by Ukraine, that not only does Ukraine lack the tactics and the strategy to win, but they lack the military means to win, what we've done is we've created a political solution for an American president who is unwilling and unable to admit failure. So we're going to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions, not because they need cluster munitions, but because we have nothing left to give them. So we're giving them the very weapon that we ourselves say should never be used in this kind of environment, especially if you think about it. Ukraine has a history of using these weapons against civilian targets. So we gave them HIMARS. They fire HIMARS at civilian population centers. We gave them 155 millimeter artillery systems. They use those to fire on civilians. And if you don't think that the Ukrainians will use these cluster munitions against civilian targets, then you have no clue about the reality of Ukraine today. So this is a callous political decision that undermines any moral standing that the United States may have had in trying to articulate a need to provide military assistance to Ukraine in the face of what the United States calls Russian military aggression. This has nothing to do with that. This is about an American president